Hi, everyone. My name is Bill Stockton, and I'm a high school science teacher in Arley, Montana. And I'm here with Chris.
Chris Pavlovich. I teach fifth grade in Livingston, Montana. We're going to talk to you today about building goal-based units according to research. So we put this slideshow together based on a framework of literature, how to get to an end project through experiential learning using science and engineering practices and communication skills.
So when we look at the framework that and some of the past research that this is based on, you can see that the big thing here is that we want to make sure that our students are understanding design. They're doing what's called experiential learning, really working on those communication skills. And we mentioned using science practices, which will lead into those communication skills. And then how our students can use units based on milestones, and how teacher feedback, student feedback, and really just a feedback loop in general is a really big important piece to this type of learning. So when we look at the stages of backward design, it's kind of broken into three different areas. And so the first one is looking at what's the outcome that you want, or identifying the desired result. Then we want to look at what sort of evidence is going to be accepted, and then planning the whole experience from the teacher's perspective and what the student would be doing throughout.
And this is research that's been around since the 1970s, and it's called Stages of Backwards Design, or sometimes Understanding by Design. And so we're really looking at, this is from the educator's point of view. What is the end result that I want with my students? What do I want them to be able to do? And then planning back to the beginning, the launch of the project, and building in those milestones on the way to the end project.
And so again, we're starting with the end in mind, and then we're working our way from that end result, whatever that is that you want your students to do, and then figuring out what you're going to use as acceptable evidence, and then what background information and learning experiences are you going to provide. So again, it's that starting at the end, but ultimately it's what you are going to be providing your students. And so what we want to focus on today is how to determine what that evidence learning is going to be, what you're going to accept, and how we're going to get there and front load it.
Yep. And so when we're talking about evidence in this portion of the presentation, we're really talking about evidence as far as teachers. So looking at evidence in assessment, and how do we determine if our students are reaching the goals that we set for them, if they're reaching those milestones. Later, you're going to hear about evidence for students. So students making claims based on evidence. And so it's two different realms from two different perspectives, but evidence is in both.
And when you talk about milestones, Chris, what exactly are you talking about?
So milestones it's kind of the structured framework. So if you have a real big goal at the end of a project, right? So we're looking at a slide called Types of Experiential Learning. And so this is all over literature, and it's been really popular the last 2 decades or so. It has a lot of different names: problem-based, goal-based, case-based, simulation or role play. And I'm going to get to place-based in a second. But really, it's thinking about how you can engage students in either a problem to solve or a goal to reach, like maybe an engineering challenge, or get a case-based study, or presenting them with that essential question. And that's the end of the unit. And all of the steps along the way that they would need to perform in order to reach that unit, those steps are identified as milestones, and you help guide those. I do have place-based on here that's pink. This is a Yellowstone cutthroat trout. My favorite. It's like the koala bear of the Yellowstone watershed. And so place-based is shown through several pieces of research. We're going to show that in the next slide. But this one particularly has students understanding the nature of science through context. And it basically does wonders for academic achievement in science. So place-based all the way.
And one of our hopes as we go through this is that, teachers start using more local data and local scientists to really drive home that place-based piece with our students, so that they can feel the connection to their community and where they live. And So hopefully after you guys get through, watching this and going through the course, you have a better understanding of how to take that place and make it relevant in your classroom. And so just kind of to reiterate, those milestones are what we're breaking down that bigger goal into so that you have things that you can measure along the way.
Awesome.
So when we look at place-based, we can kind of break it down into what makes it so powerful, and the qualities that make it useful for our students. We're thinking about the fact that it's very complex, it's open-ended. We look at how the instructor becomes just a resource for the students. They're not the one actually leading the thought process. The students are the ones leading that. There is an equal amount of time that needs to be allotted for both the learning piece for the student, but also the reflection. And I mentioned that briefly earlier that, there's the teacher reflection piece, but there still needs to be self-reflection, peer reflection. That needs to come from lots of different people. When we do this type of learning, we also really want to make sure that we're thinking about it from different perspectives. So it's a good opportunity to teach your kids about stakeholders and different people that have an opinion on whatever it is that you're focusing on. And then that last piece down there about accuracy and the contextualization of nature of science. Can you kind of touch on that just a bit, Chris?
And so we talked a little bit about that in the last slide. And, when we're thinking about accuracy and contextualization, that means that the students are going to be able to generalize something from a place to a larger context of science as far as content goes. And, with Bill and I's work across the state with professional development in science, we all know that time is precious, and it's even more limited now during the COVID era than it ever has been. And so we're thinking about, if I spend all of this time talking about this place-based thing, how is it going to help me teach my content? And Herman from 2018 says it is going to do that. It's definitely going to transfer, and they're going to be more accurate and be able to generalize those within different contexts, because it's going to be more memorable. And Bill talked a little bit more about reflection. And, we're talking about science practices as we go along with this. And we're thinking about what is a practice, a science and engineering practice. And professionals are ones who practice, including scientists and engineers. And so we get into those science practices. We're thinking about the practice of professionals is to reflect and refine. And we do that as teachers all the time. So the more that we can engage students in their own reflection and being critical about that in order to get better and refine their practices in science and engineering along those milestones, getting feedback from both their own reflections, but from teachers who are more of the guide on the side rather than the sage on the stage. And their peers, they're going to have a better product, a more complete product, more thought out product by that end. And it's assessment for learning where they're spiraling through and refining that. It was part of where their accuracy and contextualization comes in too. And so all of these things kind of triangulate them to be as powerful as possible.
Yeah, and I think the piece too with the reflection is it's something we as teachers have to teach our students. And so we want to make sure that it's a skill that, we're showing them how to be reflective and also how to reflect another's work, or discuss that work and peer review it or edit it. Because those are skills that a lot of students don't come into our classrooms naturally knowing, whether that's a kindergarten student or even a senior in high school. It's a skill that they need to continue to work on. So at the end of this, when we talk about kind of the final goal of project-based learning, we want to make sure that it's evidence-based. And that evidence-based goal can come in the form of a claim, which is an answer to some sort of question that we're looking at. It can come in the form of an argument where they're using evidence to support their side of an issue, a solution to a problem, or even it can be in the form of a model to better understand a phenomenon that's going on. So again, the key though is it needs to be evidence-based. And so we want to make sure that they're able to find that evidence and that evidence supporting their goal.
And for K-5 teachers, we have the term evidence in pretty much all of our standards, where they're in our social studies standards, science standards, and both realms of Common Core. And so evidence is a really big part of what we're doing throughout the day. And to be able to zone in on that through a bigger project and have them refine their practice with it is really important. What forms of evidence students can be using can be a combination of things, or they can be, or it could be just one form. And so what I mean by that is it can be research. So they could be finding reliable sources on the internet, or, all the way up through high school, looking at peer-reviewed journals. They can also be getting their evidence from experts and meeting scientists. They could be conducting their own investigations and using evidence from that. And then what this course is really driven at is using data and analyzing that data, building models from the data, and using that as evidence too. And so that's another form of evidence that they can use to base a claim that answers an essential question, or to construct an argument with the evidence of data, to be able to use evidence to do that, as well as build a solution or a model.
So we mentioned that this is really a practice for what we should be doing as educators, right? And so when we look at, our role and why we want to do things like place-based learning and project-based learning, we can see that on average, students spend 266% more time on a concept or assignment in this model when the project is poorly planned. So using your time wisely and making sure that it's all laid out before you get started is extremely important. And where that structure comes from is setting the milestones that we talked about earlier. And so we're going to show you a little bit later what that might look like as you plan it out. But the idea is, before you get your students into one of these project-based learning opportunities, you want to make sure that those milestones are hammered out and you have an idea of how you as the teacher are going to provide resources, and when you're going to provide those resources, and how the feedback pieces are all going to work. So prepare early so that your students are better prepared to use their time wisely and get more engaged in what they're doing, and it becomes more useful for them.
One of the biggest critiques of project-based learning is the amount of time that it takes. And a large counter narrative to that, or the counter narrative that we're presenting to you, is that project-based learning, when completely open-ended and without a goal or a structure, can take 266 more time, 6% more time on a concept. And that's not a good use of anybody's time, right? But if you can contextualize and reflect critically and help students kind of hone their skills with a milestone activity structure, then you're gonna get a lot more bang for your buck.
So we get really into the piece where we need a plan then to make sure that our students are ready and that we're ready to give them the best opportunity as possible. And so when we think about setting our different milestones that we've been talking about, it should include 3 key components. It should include the explicit instruction. So what is it that you as the teacher are going to be providing the student? It should include some sort of student performance task. So what is it that the student's going to be doing? And it should include some form of feedback. We have teacher peer down there, but I would also say that you could have individual reflection or that, but all 3 of those components should be a piece of every milestone. And depending on the standard that you're looking at, there's not a set number of milestones that are going to help you reach that standard or that goal. But once you kind of get into it and you can look through the standard, you'll come up with a reasonable number of milestones that'll get you there. And if we're utilizing our time wisely, and you're going to be hitting standards, and just like Chris mentioned earlier, across the board in elementary and in high school, you're definitely going to be hitting Common Core math and reading. And so it's all about the design and the setup to how useful it's going to be. But the key here, milestones need to have those 3 components as often as you can for all your milestones. So we mentioned that we are basing a lot of what our students should be doing in our classroom on the science practices. And so when we look at NGSS, NGSS is divided into 3 main components for science education. You got the DCIs, which is the disciplinary core ideas. We have the SEPs, or the science and engineering practices, and the CCs, or the cross-cutting concepts. So when we think about scientists as practitioners and what is it that they're doing all day, every day, these are the 8 things that they're doing. And we want to make sure that in our classrooms, our students are doing these as much and as frequently as possible. And so using project-based learning activities is a great opportunity to get our students doing several of these. And that is really what this is about. So here's an example when we look at an individual standard. And so here you can see we've got Earth Science Middle School Standard, Earth and Human Activity. You can see just below there that it talks about what actually the student needs to do. So the student needs to be able to apply a scientific principle to design a method for monitoring and minimizing human impact on the environment. So that's a very broad standard. And that's one of the things about NGSS is it's very broad. It allows us then to make it project-based, make it relevant, make it place-based. And that's what's great about this. You'll also notice under every standard, there'll be those 3 components we talked about: the science and engineering practices, the DCIs, or the disciplinary core ideas, and the cross-cutting concepts.
And so when we're thinking about next generation science standards compared to Montana science standards, something that's really noteworthy is that there's a direct correlation, 1-to-1 correlation between the 2. And so for every Montana science standard, and there's even a document that will provide to you that you can click on that and it shows you the next generation science standard that's comparable. And so the reason that our standards don't look like this and they don't have all 3 of these constructed in there is because of the way that we need to write standards for Montana. It goes right into rule or in law form. And so we don't have enough, literally, we don't have enough space within the law or within how we can write them to make them look like this. And so there's that correlation. And so I always recommend that when looking at a Montana science standard, because they are a little bit different than Next Gen, because we have the addition of Indian Education for All, and some of the engineering portions of that are just a bit different too. So I would start with the Montana science standard and then look at the next generation science standard that correlates to that, because you'll get a lot more information.
So then this is looking at, so we looked at the engineering practices, and then we just looked at what an evidence statement might look like. Now we're looking at scientific communication skills and how we can break them down into various categories. These are the skills, that we know that scientists communicate, and that's one of the key things that they have to be able to do. And so when we're thinking about, not only do we have the practices, one of those practices deals directly with communication. And these are different ways that you can have your students communicate in your classroom, whether it's listening and observing, writing, whatever the case may be. And so this is a great flow chart to get you thinking about specific things that you can have your students creating that would fall underneath this communication practice.
And this is a piece of research that came out in 2009. And so the science and engineering practices didn't come out until 2012 with the framework for science education by the National Research Council. And so this was before that, but it was some of the preliminary research that said that scientists are communicating, and they're communicating all the time. And what the results of this study was that any student who received explicit instruction in just one cluster, and one of those clusters had better academic achievement or better academic achievement scores on standardized tests. We're not testing because of standardized tests, right? But I know that that's one of our goals and one of our pressures for time. And so teaching these clusters, and really they do come into contact with the science and engineering practices. We're obtaining, evaluating, and communicating information in science. How we do that either through models, with evidence, making a claim, it's there. Most all of the standards are about obtaining and communicating information, even though that is also one of the practices. And so what the study found was that students who were high performing, they had explicit instruction in one of these clusters, and they could perform better than not receiving any instruction, even without any practice. And then students who were not high performing students, so you have like average to lower performing students, they would perform better if they received explicit instruction and practice in one of the clusters. But they did find out also, I know that I am really guilty of seeing a student who's younger than me and all of their technology is just kind of part of them. And it's almost like it operates straight from their brain to their fingers. I'm like, oh, they know how to, right? But students are not gaining any of these communication skills, especially when it involves the interface of technology without explicit instruction. And so that's part of those milestones and background information, is to think about what students need to be able to do to perform.
So a big piece of all of this is providing feedback. And so we really want to think about when it's appropriate to provide feedback and what type of feedback we're providing, and how feedback helps build up the work that our students are doing, and making sure that feedback is just intertwined throughout our instruction. And so that's why when we talk about the milestone piece, we really need feedback in each layer. And that's all based on some research, right? So could you tell us about some of that research, Chris?
Sure. So this is research from 2007 from the particular authors that are listed. There's also one that was from Pong, was the name of the study. And it's about argumentation as a strategy. And that was, I believe, 2014. But all what this body is saying basically is that it's not just about teaching it and moving on. It's about getting feedback for learning, and so that assessment is not just a stopping point and then you move on, right? And so when we have our goal, we want our students to be able to perform as best as they possibly can. Deep understanding, being able to explain it, and that their science communication skills, those practices, they're refined. They've been working on them throughout, which means that all of these milestones where you are assessing them is about assessment for learning, and so that they're able to move forward. And we call that formative assessment or formative feedback. That feedback is transforming the product at the end, and it's building up. And you're basing your instruction and your feedback, they're kind of intertwining and going together. And that's how the students are going to be as accurate. They're going to be able to generalize to different contexts, and they're going to understand the nature of science as deeply as possible, which means when they get into some of those standards-based assessments, like the SBACs or the Montana Science Assessments, where it is a performance assessment. And yes, there's content in there, but it's also about how do you apply it and what are your skills, that they're going to be able to succeed a little bit more. And again, with the caveat that we don't teach because we care about tests. We teach because we care about kids, but administrators care about tests. And I know that whenever we're judged based on tests, and this is a way to kind of get both, to get something engaging, something that's good for kids, and something that's going to give you some results that you can feel good about.
And when we talk about, this style of learning taking a lot more time, that's another way that we can justify the time that we're spent, because there's research that's supporting that when that extra time's taken and we're allowing our students to reflect on their work and revise their work, even though we know it's taking more time out of our instruction, that it's useful time. And if we can support that, like you mentioned to your administrators, it's one more tool as teachers that we can say, hey, this is useful work and it's worth the extra time that we're spending doing it. So moving on to this slide, we're looking at, what is our role then? And so the key, when we're setting up those milestones is that explicit instruction piece. So we need to make sure that we're providing sufficient background that our students can be successful. So there's a fine line here. We don't want to give them everything. We don't want to give them all the answers, but we want to make sure that they're also not in a place where they just don't know where to start. And so I think you can scaffold this what best fits your students. And I think even within your classroom, you're going to have some students that you're going to need to sit down and give more background information than students, that might be more experienced in that area. And so as a teacher, you can make that call. But the key is you need to provide enough background information for them to at least get the project going and on the right track. We mentioned again that there needs to be multiple pieces of feedback coming from you as well. And so the best way to do that obviously is using rubrics so that they know what's expected. Having one-on-one conferences if it's available, and having that time to sit down and talk to them about their work and how they're feeling about their work, and or even work checklists. Like, did you meet these things? Have them check it, and then just, briefly check in on those. And then having opportunities to do similar things with their peers. And the key here, though, is a lot of students don't understand how to give adequate feedback. And so as a classroom teacher, you need to provide some sort of guidance. So maybe the first time you have your students do it, you have them using some sort of rubric that you created and went through as a whole class, so then they can see, from an example. Maybe you have some checklist that they're using, but you need to give them something the first few times before you just say, hey, look at your friend's lab report and see if they can provide any meaningful feedback. So I think that's key, is you and as the teacher instructing that feedback as well.
Absolutely. The only thing that I would add is that background information also includes explicit instruction and skills, right? And as teachers, we often will point directly to content, it's what we're passionate about. But in order to make sure that the child or, that student is ready to perform and is practicing some of these skills in order to refine and target them, then we need to make sure that we're explicitly teaching the skill of argumentation and using evidence in a paragraph. And how do I collect data and from an investigation? Or how do I look at a body of data in a spreadsheet and decide what to do with it, what's going to be the best mathematical model. All of those are background information pieces as well.
So when we start thinking about building units then, and according to what the literature says based on project-based learning, what we should have is some sort of launch, some sort of intro to the problem that we have and what that goal that we want them to accomplish is. We then are going to have those milestones that we mentioned before. You're going to set, and that number varies based on what that goal is you're trying to get to and what standard you're focusing on. At the end of going through many of those milestones, there needs to be that review piece in there somewhere. At this diagram has it towards the end. It could be throughout, and it should be throughout, because we remember each milestone should have some form of that feedback and review. And then eventually we have what we're calling the landing, or that final project, where we can say, here's the goal, the student met the goal, and this is where they would provide that evidence-based claim or that model or that argument or whatever it is, that artifact essentially that they're going to use to demonstrate that they've met their goal. That final piece needs to come after revision, right? So they're going to have a piece at one point. They do need to revise it. And so that's where that extra time needs to come in. So when we take what the research is saying, how can we then put it into our practice in our classroom? And so here is a great template that we can use to kind of get us thinking along the lines of each milestone containing a student performance task, explicit instruction, and a feedback loop. And then once you kind of get going through, because you want to plan this out ahead of time, you can fill in due dates or roughly how many days you think each piece might take you to get through. So this would be a great template to kind of get those ideas out. And then that way you can see, are you having feedback loops with every milestone? Are you having explicit instruction? And really thinking about what that explicit instruction looks like. And then what task is it that you need your students to accomplish for every milestone?
And so when you're starting with this template, you're really starting at the bottom. You're starting with the landing and deciding what do I need to see that students are doing? What is evidence for their learning? And we're going to show you how to find evidence for learning for each standard, so that it's not a guessing game. It's black and white in the standards. We're going to show you where that is.
So again, if we look at one of those standards, if you go to the NGSS website and you find an individual standard, if you look up evidence statements, you get that standard like we mentioned before. So this is the same standard at the top. You'll notice that it's missing the three different components of NGSS, but just underneath those on the standard sheet, you should see a list of observable features. And so for this standard, where we were looking at designing a method for monitoring and minimizing human impact, there were three observable features that students should be able to do for a teacher in order to meet that standard. And so you can see that they're numbered 1, 2, 3, and then you can see that there's subsets of things. And when you look at them, they're skills. They're missing some of that DCI component. That's where the content, in the past has always been the driving force, but it really shouldn't be the driving force and isn't. It's the science practice. And that's why we can use local great information to supplement the DCI piece and get our kids thinking about local problems and or local situations. So once you find the evidence statement, that is where you find the observable features. And it's these observable features that make for great milestones, right? Those are the things your kids should be doing in order to ultimately demonstrate that they can apply scientific principles to design a method for monitoring and minimizing human impact.
And the shift from content to practices is kind of a big one, right? Because we're thinking content drives, that's what we're tested on. That's what, and I keep saying tested because I know that is a critique of project-based learning. How am I going to meet all of my standards for those tests at the end? I've heard that question over and over and over again. I just want to speak to that. But these are verbs. So what I do when I'm looking at an evidence statement is I focus in on the verbs and think about what a student can learn if they're able to perform those verbs and to do it well. Because most of those tests these days are giving them a pretty decent amount of background knowledge in context for what they're doing. And they can know content really, really well and not be able to apply it. But if they're applying content and they have the skills to be able to work through those and problem solve and think critically, they're more likely to be able to draw on that content or figure that out. And we don't want them to think that they can Google. We can't Google everything, right? We've got to be able to solve new problems.
So when we start to fill out one of these planning templates, as Chris mentioned, we want to start with the landing. And so if we look down at the bottom there, we're going to zoom in here for us.
Give me a second. Oh, I'm doing a great job, you guys. There we go.
So we can see that if we think about what the student is going to be doing, remember there's 3 pieces to our milestones. There's the student piece, there's the feedback loop piece, there's the explicit instruction piece, right? And so the teacher's column is that middle column. And so in this case, the teacher would be focusing on teaching their students some listening and observing skills. And really, what are they teaching? They need to provide explicit instruction on how to present professionally. So depending on your student's age and what they're comfortable with as far as presentations go, that's a skill that as a teacher, we need to be helping our students with. And as we mentioned, scientists are doing this. And so we should be helping our kids do it. What the student will be creating is a presentation, and what they're going to be is presenting on the solution they created based on the scientific principles in order to monitor and minimize that human impact. And then you can see the reflection piece as their presentations are happening. There can be this self-reflection, teacher feedback, peer feedback. So we can get all 3 of them in that final landing. So then how do we get to the landing piece is those milestones.
And so really so Bill and I did this by looking at the standard that we just showed you. And we took the standard and applied it to the landing. What do they need to be able to do? And then broke down through those 3 steps. These are the 3 things that they need to be able to do with subcategories, and broke those down into milestones, thinking about how can we get students to this point where they're really successful and make sure that they're going to be able to have a nice product at the end, but more importantly, refine their skills and understand how to process data a little bit more.
And so when we look at the student performance task, as Chris mentioned earlier, we're highlighting the verbs, right? What are the students doing? What science are they doing? They're identifying, explaining, they're generating a design. It's what action are they taking? And when we look at the explicit instruction, a lot of it is really focusing on the way scientists communicate. We're going to be communicating to our students and teaching them those communication skills. And so we're looking at what type of resources should they be using, how to retrieve those resources, what is appropriate scientific reading, and where can they get that information, all of those pieces. And then explicitly showing and using the feedback loops is really important as well. So trying our best to identify 3 those three tasks within every milestone, I think is really the key there from using that evidence statement.
And you'll have access to this presentation so that you can look at this template a little bit more closely, and it'll also be in the course available.
So thank you guys for joining us, and I hope you enjoyed the presentation, and make sure if you have questions that you reach out and ask.
Yay, place-based data. We're excited.